What's up folks, it's CrushSG back with a starter guide to Helldivers 2. I know, the game's been out for a few weeks. It's a little late for a starter guide, right? Well, I actually only started playing the game myself over the past week, and despite the game already being out for some 10 days at that point, I had a surprisingly hard time finding good, concise starter information on the game when I started playing it. Google and YouTube are just flooded with quick tip videos, tier lists, 40 pro tips to make you not suck, 69 tips to liberate that bug hole, I mean. Anyway, hundreds of videos and articles, most without any proper context for someone just starting the game. Honestly, even trying to Google something as simple as what each difficulty setting did and what the rewards were took a really long time because every media outlet thinks the answer to that question is there are 9 difficulty levels and they just give increasing rewards. You don't say. And thus, as soon as I got enough time in the game to learn how most of the stuff works, got to level 20, unlocked the important stuff and such, I decided to put together this starter guide with the basic info that I had trouble finding, including some basic tips and most importantly, with some context behind the info and the tips. Anyway, super brief overview in case you aren't familiar with the game. Helldivers 2 is a third-person squad-based intergalactic shooter that is yet another game that has taken the world by storm over the past month. It launched on the 8th of February on both PC and PlayStation. I currently have about 80 hours in the game, though admittedly, probably 30 or so of those hours were spent just kind of waiting in queue to get into the game. Thankfully, their last couple of hotfixes and server capacity upgrades seem to have alleviated almost all the queue problems, for me at least, and I have been able to log in completely without a queue for the last couple of days. We'll see how it handles the rest of the weekend. Alright, so you just got the game. Well, maybe you haven't, but let's just assume you just got the game. You've done the tutorial, couple of missions, you don't remember half of what the tutorial just taught you. What should you know about Helldivers 2 to help you get things going? Well, first off, Helldivers' entire gameplay loop can be summed up as this. Run over here, pick a mission, do the mission for XP and resources. As you clear missions on one difficulty, you'll unlock harder difficulties, and doing missions on harder difficulties rewards you with more resources. Rinse and repeat until you get to the hardest difficulty and eventually unlock everything available. Oversimplified, but that's it in a nutshell. Now, a few things to note about this screen. Always hit Z to check for any special orders. Those can reward you with a nice chunk of rewards upon clearing them. Next, these yellow areas on the planets are missions that you can select. White icons that you see around the planet are actual squads already on missions that you can join. And of course, the quick play button activates the game's matchmaking system. And finally, you select the difficulty by toggling this bar left and right here. Now, the level cap in Helldivers 2 is 50. But level 20 is really the first milestone you want to work toward because that is when you'll be able to unlock every stratagem in the game. It doesn't mean you'll have the resources to unlock everything at level 20, you probably won't, so you will initially have to cherry pick which stratagems, gear, and ship upgrades that you get, depending on your playstyle, and gradually work to unlock the rest post level 20. In my view, level 1 to 20 is basically an extended tutorial on how the game works. And speaking of how the game works, let's talk about progression and difficulty tiers. So, there are 9 difficulty tiers in total in Helldivers 2. In ascending order, 1 to 9, we have trivial, easy, medium, challenging, hard, extreme, suicide, impossible, and helldive. The higher the difficulty, the higher the potential rewards, and completing missions on higher difficulties also gives you an XP multiplier. But crucial to note is, rather than directly scaling up the damage or defense of enemies and making missions more unforgiving, Helldivers 2 opts to instead scale difficulty strictly by increasing enemy variety and quantity. Each specific enemy unit you encounter has the exact same stats regardless of difficulty. So what exactly does going up in difficulty do? Well, it simply increases the sheer number of enemies present in any given map and throws progressively stronger enemy types into the mix. Higher difficulties also tend to group missions up into clusters of 2 or more missions, where completing missions in the same cluster gives you progressively increased medal rewards. Okay, on the progression front, there are really 2 main parts to progression: early game and late game. And this is where I pretend to be an absolute pro gamer and tell you I'm only covering the early game in this video because this is just the starter guide. It is definitely not because I just got to level 20 myself and have barely started the proper late game stuff. Jokes aside, as mentioned earlier, I classify the early game as more or less level 1 to 20. So to better understand early game progression, let's go over all the currencies and their associated systems in the game. First, we have requisitions and samples, and these 2 currencies are tied to upgrades which you purchase via the ship management terminal, which is accessed here in your ship. Requisitions are used to unlock stratagems, which in more common gaming terms are essentially your skills. You can eventually unlock all the stratagems available, but only get to select a total of 4 to use on each given mission. While most stratagems provide additional supporting firepower like airstrikes, nukes, and such, there are also support weapon stratagems that actually give you a 3rd extra weapon in addition to your primary and secondary weapons. Requisitions are rewarded by completing the main and the side objectives during missions and can also be looted from various points of interest on any given map. Now, samples are used to unlock upgrades directly to your ship. These upgrades then permanently buff a given category of stratagems, making them more powerful, reducing their cooldowns, and such. Samples come in 3 rarities. We have common, rare, and super, and samples are looted from various points of interest during missions, and the rarity of the samples in a given mission is directly tied to the difficulty of the mission. By number, difficulties 1 through 3 have only common samples. 4 through 6 have both common and rare samples, and 7 through 9 have all 3 rarities. So those are requisitions and samples. Up next we have medals, and these are used to unlock weapons, armors, boosters, emotes, super credits and stuff from the war bonds, which can be accessed by pressing the default R key on the keyboard. Medals are awarded for completing missions and can be looted from various points of interest during missions, much like requisitions are. War bonds are Helldivers' form of battle passes, except rather than providing the typical battle pass peripheral rewards, they actually are your primary source of weapon and armor unlocks. Now, I know the last bit probably has some eyebrows raised, but not to worry. Let's talk about Helldivers' premium currency, super credits. Super credits can be used to purchase armor offered by the superstore, as well as used to unlock the premium war bond. Now remember, war bonds are like battle passes, right? And like most battle pass systems, Helldivers has a massive free battle pass or massive free war bond, and then a smaller premium war bond. Notice how I use the word premium rather than paid. This is because super credits are surprisingly farmable without actually spending a cent. Now, I'm not talking about the bullshit marketing claims of, oh, you can farm it from regular play. No. Seriously, I was able to farm up the 1,000 super credits required to unlock the premium war bond by the time I got to level 13 or 14. I've also been able to farm enough super credits to buy at least one item from the superstore every single rotation since I started playing the game. Super credits can be looted in the same manner as medals and requisitions, and you can additionally claim more super credits with medals from one node on each Warbond page. And this applies to both the free and the premium Warbond pages. And those were the currencies and related progression systems. Let's just get the player stat progression out of the way first, because there is no player stat progression in Helldivers 2. You unlock stratagems, armor, weapons, and rely solely on those to increase your combat abilities. As for gear progression, again, there isn't much progression here other than working to unlock the entire arsenal of armor and weapons via the war bonds and the superstore. Maybe they'll introduce better and stronger gear down the road, but for now, both weapons and armor are pretty standard across the board. For weapons, we have the standard weapon types: pistols, SMGs, assault rifles, marksman rifles, shotguns, energy weapons. Not much else to say here. It shouldn't be foreign to anyone playing a shooter game. And for armor, we have 3 armor slots: body armor, helm, and cape. And so far, all helms and capes seem to carry exactly the same stats across the board, and the only slot that has any stat variance being the body armor. So there are 3 classes of body armor: light, medium, and heavy. It is unclear exactly what the boundaries are for differentiating each armor class. Thus far, I have seen 2 different armor ratings on light armors, 2 different armor ratings on medium armors, and 1 specific armor rating on heavy armor. That said, I don't think the actual class of the armor is all that important. What is important, however, is this general rule. The armor rating stat is inversely correlated with the movement speed and stamina stats, where the higher the armor rating, the slower the speed, and the lower the stamina stats. So if you want to move faster and have better stamina regen, go with something that has a lower armor rating, and of course, vice versa. It is worth mentioning that armor rating is currently bugged on certain body armors where it offers essentially no protection. Not all armors are affected by this bug, and to my knowledge, there isn't a definitive list of armors that are specifically affected by this bug. What I do know is it is currently flagged as a known issue by the dev team, so I'm sure they'll get around to fixing it soon enough. Now, aside from that bug, all body armor also comes with a passive effect that provides buffs, such as reducing recoil while crouched or prone, or increasing throw range, stuff like that. There are only a handful of passives available at the moment, and you'll come across all of them pretty quickly. As far as I can tell, passives aren't specifically locked to one body armor class. I've seen the same passive across all 3 classes of body armor from various sources. Alright, so that was the core systems and basic mechanics out of the way. Let's talk about some of the more nuanced tips and stuff. See, the thing about Helldivers 2 is it is, for the most part, built to be a co-op game. And it is very comms heavy, voice or otherwise. It is not impossible to play the game solo, of course. It's just that it's almost always going to be more resource and time efficient to play it in a group. Now that said, not everyone can or likes playing in groups all the time. I personally dislike pugging in any game. Too many unknown variables, not everyone has comms. I personally don't always like to be on comms myself, thus I only group with folks I know personally, which works out to me playing this game solo almost as much as I group up. The short of it is play with a group if you can, but if you can't, here are a few strategies and tips for going solo. The first tip is to always play on the lowest possible difficulty for the resource that you need, unless you're farming XP specifically. XP is unique, and I'll give you a tip on that later. So this is a pure efficiency thing. The game is balanced around teams of 4, so you're essentially soloing a 4-man mission no matter what difficulty you're playing on. Now the XP and requisition rewards for completing mission objectives, they might receive bonuses from the multipliers on higher difficulties that I showed in that spreadsheet, but that is not usually proportional to the increase in difficulty or time required to complete the mission when you are solo. And the same goes for the medal rewards, of course. On the other hand, the quantities of currencies that you get specifically from looting points of interest are the same regardless of the difficulty settings. For example, you always get 10 super credits whenever you loot super credits, 100 requisitions, 1 to 3 medals if you loot those respectively. These looted resources do not benefit from the difficulty bonus multiplier, so it is more efficient to drop the difficulty way down and just run through missions looting all the points of interest before extracting. Now, of course, some specific examples. If you are targeting a lootable resource like medals, requisitions, super credits, or common samples, the most efficient difficulty to farm those while solo is actually on the trivial difficulty, and specifically you want to be doing this on liberation campaign planets. Defend campaign planets, not that great for solo farming lootables because there's the whole timer, you kind of got to stay on objective and stuff like that. Trivial liberation missions usually only have one objective, and the maps are far smaller and less complicated. You drop into a given mission, complete the objective, and start running clockwise or anti-clockwise in a circle around the map, loot all the points of interest you can find, and then extract. How do you find points of interest? There is no secret or special technique here. Yes, I know you can get creative with the Scout Armor passive to help locate points of interest, but honestly, Helldivers is pretty consistent with point of interest placement. Aside from the yellow beams, if you see an empty area of a certain size on the map that you haven't run past, there is a very good chance you'll find a point of interest in that area. You get the hang of the POI placement after a few practice runs. Anyway, each trivial mission will typically have anywhere from 8 to 12 lootables in total from the various points of interest, which includes both the ones marked by the yellow beams, as well as containers that you destroy with grenades. Each of these lootables can spawn as one of 4 things: medals, super credits, requisitions, or a support weapon. And once you're in the groove of it, it can take as little as 10 minutes per run, plus a couple of minutes for that silly, unskippable end screen. Now, not to forget that each mission at Trivial usually has between 12 to 15 common samples that you can loot, of which you would probably be picking up 10 to 12 during your average point of interest runabout. At this rate, you're looking at an average of about 900-ish XP, about 25 to 30 medals, because you also get one for completing each mission, 115 to 120 super credits, and about 3,500 to 4,000 requisitions, and 50 or so common samples per hour. Now, this is of course a fraction of what you can get with a decent squad in group play, but it is very good as far as solo play goes. And it is certainly way more efficient, less frustrating, and thus much more fun than the fastest hard difficulty solo runs I've personally done. Now, on the other hand, if you're trying to farm rare samples, then the lowest difficulty you'll need is challenging. Again, you want liberation campaign missions, and you want to be doing full looting runs as far as possible. Your focus here should likewise be completing the main objective and looting as many points of interest as possible. Otherwise, the maps are larger in challenging difficulty, but I find the same clockwise or anti-clockwise sweep works fine in challenging as well. Though you can work the map like a grid, do it in a zigzag, whichever method you are most comfortable with for map coverage. Side objectives should only be done if you come across them along the way and they specifically aren't something too time-consuming like the artillery one. Now, something like destroying a facility or uploading pod data, those are fine to do along the way for the bonus XP and requisitions. And of course, the radar one is worth doing even though it takes a while, simply because it then marks all the points of interest on the map and you can go loot everything. So that was rare samples. What about super samples? Honestly, at my skill level, I don't have a solo tip for farming super samples. If you find yourself able to reliably solo suicide or above, hey, go for it. I'm personally going to have to group up for my super sample farming from here on. I'm just not good enough to reliably solo suicide and above difficulties. Alright, finally we get to solo XP farming. And it would be remiss of me to not at least emphasize that group play for XP is significantly faster than solo play in basically every single scenario. But if you must farm XP solo, and you're less interested in farming lootables while farming said XP, then your best bet is to specifically farm automaton defend campaign missions on medium difficulty. You see, on medium, automaton defense missions still have a chance to spawn single drop-in and win type objective missions, like upload pod data, disrupt the supply chain, and such. I believe there's only one such mission on the Terminate side, but I can't remember which one it is. The idea here is to seek out these single objective missions, bring your biggest, baddest, big damage stratagems, drop right on the main objective, complete it, and extract ASAP. Once you get into the groove of things, it takes about 4 to 5 minutes per mission, or about 7 minutes including the silly end screen. All in, you get about 250 to 260 XP per run, which then works out to just over 2000 XP an hour. So yeah, it's just over twice as fast for XP as the loot farming run that I gave in tip 2, but I personally prefer getting half the XP in exchange for getting all those lootable resources along the way as well. I mean, you might be able to get to level 20 a little faster, but you're still going to need to farm everything else eventually. You might as well do it all together in a single, highly efficient and repeatable farming run, in my opinion, anyway. Alright, so those were the solo-specific tips. Now here's a handful of basic combat tips, and I have exactly 10 tips here. Tip number 1 is many objective-based actions, including reinforcing teammates, actually show up in the stratagem menu. That was not terribly obvious to me when I first started playing. Hell bombs, for example, or calling down SSSDs, using the artillery strikes after capturing the artillery side objective. All of these things show up in the stratagem menu when applicable, so familiarize yourself with that menu. And tip number 2 is all loot is shared in Helldivers 2. Realize this really quickly and stop fighting over loot. It is annoying. On the same note, samples you have looted drop if you die, so make sure you or a teammate runs to pick them up before moving off if anyone dies. Tip number 3 is always call in your support stratagems ASAP upon landing. This took me a long time to get for some reason, so I just thought I'd throw it in. Calling the support stratagems down early sets off the cooldown timer, right? Which then allows those cooldowns to come up sooner. And there's a chance you're going to be needing those support stratagems later during the mission. So having the cooldowns up sooner, well, that's always a good thing. And tip number 4, any stratagem that physically drops something down for you to loot can kill most targets that it drops on, including reinforcing teammates. So sometimes you can actually try using those offensively rather than just dropping them randomly somewhere. And tip number 5, get into the habit of calling down supply drops on cooldown. It will mitigate the reliance on something like the support backpack, which could actually feel mandatory sometimes for solo play. As you progress higher in difficulties, you really can't afford to be giving up your backpack slot for supplies while you're playing solo. I personally preemptively drop supplies into an area that I'm attacking after my initial barrage of stratagems, so I always ensure that I have supplies next to me while I'm in the thick of it. And tip number 6 is the extraction shuttle actually waits for you, as long as no one steps into the shuttle after it lands. So a lot of folks think that 20-second countdown timer, that starts as soon as the shuttle lands. No, it starts as soon as someone steps into the shuttle. Now this could be useful for you, may not be, but situationally you could use this to your advantage by actually choosing when you have to spend the 2 minutes defending the extraction point. That could be important if you're doing a really high difficulty. You don't want to be time pressured at the end, or maybe you want to avoid that whole timer runs out, you're forced to extract and you don't have your stratagems, right? So you can actually just run past and call in the extract earlier after you've completed the main objective, of course, but call it in a couple of minutes earlier, defend that area then when you're not time pressured, and then go around and loot whatever you want to loot, and then come back and the shuttle will be there. You just run straight in, jump in, and then fly off. Tip number 7 is holding the reload button, R on keyboard by default, allows you to access the weapons functions menu, and this one completely flew under my radar for a long time. And it can have a surprising number of functions for certain weapons. Depending on the weapon, this menu can allow you to select scope magnification, fire mode, rate of fire, flashlight settings, stuff like that. So remember, hold the reload button whenever you have a specific weapon equipped. Take a look at what options you have there. There might be something interesting for you. And tip number 8, dynamic aim mode might work better for you if you're on mouse and keyboard. See, Helldivers allows you to ADS in both third person and first person. If you didn't know that, you aren't alone. It took me a while to realize this myself. The way it is set up by default has you click a button to swap aim modes, but if you change this setting to dynamic aiming, it allows you to ADS in third person by holding the right click the way you normally would, and then toggling first person aim mode by tapping the right click. Give it a try. It could work for you, or maybe not. Tip number 9 is there are useful settings to mess around with in the settings menu. After a few hours of play, when you've kind of figured the game out, I recommend going back into the settings menu and reviewing your settings. You might find something in there that you're like, hey, well that's useful, maybe I should do it this way, that's so much better. You'll never know. Go back into the settings and review all your settings. And combat tip number 10 is be efficient with your shots. Go for weak points where possible. Now this is obviously a very general guideline. If I were to give you an entire video on all the weak points, it'll probably take 30 minutes or something like that. But as a very general rule, the two factions tend to have polar opposite weak points. Automatons tend to be susceptible to headshots. As the saying goes, go for the eyes. Or basically anything that glows red that isn't a weapon, shoot that. Now Terminids, on the other hand, tend to be susceptible to limb shots. Now, not all of them are. I mean, like the big ticks, the spewers, those ones are susceptible to headshots. But a good guideline is that if you can see a bug's legs from as far away or from further away than you can see its head, it's probably weak to leg shots. But of course, if it is heavily armored, well, all rules still apply. You gotta either deal with that armor or shoot somewhere else. Alright, so those were my 10 basic combat tips. Now I'm gonna give you 2 troubleshooting tips based on problems I encountered over the past week. First, if you are an AMD GPU user and are encountering driver crashes, download the latest AMD preview drivers. They specifically fix the issues with Helldivers 2. Now, since installing the preview driver, I have not encountered a single GPU-related crash, only a couple of standard game crashes which have literally only happened a couple of times over the entire week. Now, the second troubleshooting tip is if you encounter the game guard failed to connect to update server error on the Steam version of the game, a simple fix for this is to right-click on your Helldivers game in the Steam library, browse local files, go into the bin folder, select the GameGuard folder and just delete the entire GameGuard folder. No fear, no bullshit, it was not going to break your game. Just delete the GameGuard folder and start the game. The game will then detect the absence of the GameGuard folder and re-download the GameGuard files, which usually fixes the problem on the spot. Now that said, you may have to repeat this process a couple of times for it to work. The most I have personally had to repeat it is twice, and it has worked every single time I've gotten that error, and I've gotten that error probably 10 times to date. For clarity, this method does exactly the same thing as verifying the game files does. What verifying the files does for Helldivers 2 is it reinstalls the GameGuard files and then checks for any other errors in the game files. With the manual delete method, you essentially skip the anywhere from 3 to 15 minute wait for the files to be verified, depending on your system specs. And that's pretty much it for this video, folks. Yeah, I know there are a ton more tips and tricks for Helldivers 2, and I can already feel some of you kind of being tempted to type in the comments you didn't mention this and you didn't mention that. Tips and tricks was not the point of this video. I already explained what the point was at the start of the video. So hopefully after watching this, those other tip videos now make a lot more sense. Overall, Helldivers 2 has seriously impressed me on various fronts. It has extremely engaging gameplay, hilarious meme-worthy moments, super friendly and almost non-existent monetization, which is so rare and so refreshing in 2024. It does have some minor bugs, but nothing terribly game-breaking by today's bad launch standards, honestly. And as of right now, the reviews are mostly positive on Steam, but I'll put money on it being actually overwhelmingly positive if you removed all the ones specifically complaining about server issues, which seems to have now largely been fixed. If you were on the fence about the game due to the launch issues, now just might be a great time to pull the trigger and dive into it to do your part in spreading democracy and liberty throughout the galaxy. As always, thumbs if you liked it, crush that subscribe button if you want to see more, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care, folks.